1,453 groups.
Mark, stop for a second. Repeat those numbers for me.
From 1,248 groups to 1,753 groups. And, of that growth, of that overall growth, by far the most explosive growth was in the anti-government patriot group, which includes militias.
When you say anti-government patriot groups, what kind of groups are you talking about?
I am talking about the groups many of our listeners will remember from the 1990s, the militias and related groups. These are basically groups that see the federal government as the primary enemy. They're not generally race-based. They certainly may have some racists within them, but they are really about the idea that the federal government is an evil entity which is involved in conspiracies like planning to impose martial law, to set up concentration camps in this country, into which it plans to throw all good patriots, and ultimately to merge or kind of subsume the American government, or America as a whole, into a kind of socialistic New World Order, a one-world government.
Mark, these patriot groups, and what were the growth in patriot groups this year?
They grew, they added 363 new groups in a single year. That works out to 244%, an amazing rise.
And you say that these groups are not all hate groups.
That's true. Well, none of them are hate groups. They really have a fundamentally different view of the world. The Klan groups and the neo-Nazi groups and so on are really about race. It is black people, brown people, yellow people, the Jews, or whoever it might be, who they identify as the enemy, the people who are really doing us all in. And that's quite different from the view of the world that the Patriots have.
So, but now that the government, now that the face of our government is an African American, is there more race-based kind of ferment out there?
Yes, I think that's exactly right. I think, it's really a bit different from the militia movement of the 90s in that sense. As you said, the face of the government is the face of a black man, and that seems to have increased the frustration and anger of many, many people out there. I think behind all of that are great worries and fears about the changing demographics of our country overall, the kind of darkening of the population.
Mark, I know history has a tendency of, kind of repeating itself, and as I recall, we saw something similar to this growth of anti-government groups, growth of militias, back in the 1990s. Is that correct?
It's absolutely correct. We saw a very similar growth in these kinds of groups, accompanied by really wild conspiracy theories that always identified ultimately the government as the enemy. At the same time, the groups, they were called militias. They were very much into paramilitary training and so on. As a matter of fact, 6 months before the Oklahoma City bombing in 1995, you recall, I'm sure, that we sent a letter to Attorney General Janet Reno and several attorneys general of other states warning that the mixture of guns and those who hate or those who have these kinds of ideas was a recipe for disaster, and it turned out to be a prescient letter indeed.
You got in Oklahoma City, 168 men, women, and children died that day, did they not?
They did, including 19 children in a daycare center.
Now, Mark, I know at the time of the Oklahoma City bombing, you were a reporter, I think, for USA Today. Is that correct?
Yes.
Did you cover the McVeigh trial?
Yeah, well, I covered the bombing itself as well as the McVeigh trial. And, I'll tell you, I was based in Dallas at the time, and I actually reached Oklahoma City while the building was still on fire. They hadn't come anywhere close to figuring out how many people had died. They were still trying to pull bodies and wounded people out of there, and it was a revelatory experience. In fact, it's really what, more than anything else, drove me to this work here today. My own son that day, my one and only child, turned 9 months old, and for some reason that story, well, one can imagine, affected me and many people as no other story had.
Yeah, now, did you cover the trial as well?
I did. I covered McVeigh's trial.
What was McVeigh like?
A strange, icy, smug man. He would come in the mornings before the jury was allowed into the jury box. He would flirt with the women, sort of outrageously all the time. He'd joke with his attorneys like he was having the time of his life. Then when the jury would show up, he'd go into this kind of ice-cold mode. It was an amazing thing. It is worth remembering. This guy was, quite intelligent, but incredibly cold and sort of evil. I mean, at one point I remember he never testified in trial, but after the trial and shortly before he was executed, he gave interviews to people who wrote a book, American Terrorist, about him. The most chilling thing I can remember him saying is he's talking about the children, the 19 children he murdered. He said, to these people in Oklahoma who lost a loved one, I'm sorry, but it happens every day. You're not the first mother to lose a kid or the first grandparent to lose a grandson or granddaughter.
Yeah, it's really grotesque, isn't it?
Yeah, and he did come off that way, as he thought a lot of himself as the kind of icy cold soldier who was willing to do what needed to be done.
Are there still people out there who think that the federal government in some ways was complicit in the Oklahoma City bombing, or they knew about it in advance?
Oh, I think probably the majority of people in the patriot groups that exist right now believe that. Almost immediately after that building was bombed, the theory came up in various iterations that, yes, it was the government who did it, that the building couldn't possibly have come down from a truck bomb. There had to be internal bombs, that, all law enforcement officials were warned away before the bombing. That was, of course, utterly false.
Similar, I guess, to some of the crazy things that go on about the plane crashes into the World Trade Center.
That's true. I mean, the very same kinds of theories, although most of those originated more on the left than the right. Of course, there were right-wing versions in which, it was the Jews who engineered the attack on the World Trade Center in order to draw America into the war. But yes, very similar kind of conspiracy theorizing.
While we're talking about the Oklahoma City bombing, I'd like to say hello to Carrie Watkins, who I know has joined us today. She's listening from the Oklahoma City National Memorial. And their lesson is to teach the lessons learned in the Oklahoma City bombing. She sent in a question for you, Mark. She asks if you have any advice for them as we approach the 15-year anniversary of the bombing.
Well, they, of course, do their own work very well, and I'm not sure they need our advice. But, I mean, what I would say overall, it seems to me that the lesson of all of this is that words and ideas have consequences. When one starts to spin tall tales about concentration camps and secret weather machines meant to destroy American farmers and, this endless series of conspiracy theories. Well, these conspiracy theories are not merely amusing ideas held by people on the far fringes of society. These are theories that demonize, that identify a target and demonize that target. Latinos, Mexicans are secretly planning to conquer the United States. The Jews are secretly planning this or that, and it goes on from there. But the point is, ultimately, there is a target, and some small sliver of the population that kind of imbibes these theories and ideas feels that they have to go out and kill to defend themselves and the rest of the society. It seems to me that the other important lesson in this is that these ideas, this kind of propaganda, have ostensibly mainstream kind of aiders and abettors, people who are political commentators on television and politicians who essentially promote these ideas. And that's shocking, but I think very much true.
Now, the Oklahoma incident, I think, is, seared not just in your mind, Mark, but in the minds of so many of the people who are probably listening today. Since that time, have there been many other attacks or conspiracies by right-wing extremists?
A huge number. We published a very short time ago, last year, a booklet called something like 75 Plots, Conspiracies, and Racist Rampages. And, what that booklet detailed were an enormous string, mainly of attempted domestic terrorist attacks. What happened was that after Oklahoma City, law enforcement became very, very aware of the threat and acted very proactively. But just to give our listeners an idea of the kinds of things I'm talking about, in 1998 in Wise County in Texas, there was an attempt by people on the radical right to blow up a natural gas refinery located right next to an elementary school. The idea of these people was that they would blow up the refinery. That would draw all law enforcement and firefighters, paramedics, and so on to that side of the county. Then this small crew of about half a dozen people would go out and rob banks to raise money to create the revolution. The point of the story, the real point, is that when those people were captured because the leader got cold feet and went and told the FBI about this plot, the federal authorities announced that 10 to 30,000 people probably would have died. It's worth pointing out that's 10 times the number of people who died in the World Trade Center.
That's amazing. That's amazing. Now, what about this guy? It was last month, I think someone flew a plane into an IRS building in Texas.
Yeah, we had two similar